Good day. Welcome to Western Hills. Book of Esther today. We're in Esther chapter 2. Last week in the book of Esther chapter 1, we learned about King Xerxes and how his queen Vashti had disappointed him in the decree he put against her that she would never be queen again. And today we're picking up in chapter 2 where we find King Xerxes recalling and thinking about what the queen had done, and we read several of the king's servants and their concern for their king, and they give him recommendations on what to do. So with that, let's get into our study. Esther chapter 2, verse 1 reads, After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus, talking about Xerxes here, King Ahasuerus, subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. After the king's wrath had subsided, he remembered the deeds of Vashti and his decree that deposed her. The king remembered this. Did the king regret his rash action and maybe want to reinstate her? He couldn't have done this. He would have been prevented from reinstating her because the decree he put out was irrevocable. He couldn't go back on his word. Maybe the king's thoughts were that it was time to find a replacement for Queen Vashti. Now we don't know what happened to Queen Vashti. Rabbinic tradition has she was executed, but she could also have led a life as a recluse. We just don't know. And as a timeline, the king divorced Vashti in the 3rd year of his reign, and he did not marry Esther until the 7th year. So it kind of gives you an idea where we're at here. Verse 2. Then the king's servants who attended him said, Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. So the king's personal attendants proposed that the king choose another wife from among the beautiful young virgins. Why did they do this? Well, perhaps they feared retaliation from Vashti, assuming she was still alive, and she was reinstated to the king's favor. I mean, after all, they had a lot to do with her being put away, and maybe they were fearful of her. Or it could be that they were just concerned with the king's unhappiness and it was impacting them. Um, or maybe they were just truly worried about the king, seeing his unhappiness. Or maybe the king's servants were thinking about who they could put in place of Queen Vashti. Maybe someone they could control, unlike Vashti. It's no different today. You think about it, you have the servants of the people who enforce the laws of the land and collect taxes, and they end up directing the king's action. So maybe these guys covertly were trying to put somebody in there, some queen that they could kind of control. Verse 3. And let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan the citadel, into the women's quarters, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women, and let beauty preparations be given them. So here you go. See how the king's servants present the action that the king should take? It says here, let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of the kingdom. Two things I want to point out here is, first of all, is that it will be the men behind the scenes that select the young virgins that will be brought to Shushan. Then, It will be the eunuchs, the officials, that will oversee exactly what they can and cannot do. So what you see here is sort of a storyline how these servants are directing the king's action. Um, and for me, I just want to point out that this book of Esther, there's much more to this story than what we've been taught in the past. You see some covert actions going on here, I believe. Verse 4. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This thing pleased the king, and he did so. So verses 3 and 4 explain in detail how plans for assembling the virgins were to be carried out in all the provinces. Officials were to be appointed to locate all the beautiful young virgins and bring them to the harem. Then they would be placed under the care of the king's eunuchs and given beauty treatments of all kinds. Ointments and cosmetics would be applied to each of the virgins for 12 months in preparation for her presentation to the king. And then the one who pleased the king would be made queen in place of Vashti. Verse 5. In Shushan, the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jahar, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. At this point in the book, Mordecai is introduced for the first time. Now, his name appears 58 times in this book, but nowhere else in the Bible. Another Mordecai is mentioned in Ezra 2:2 and Nehemiah 7:7, and some scholars believe these two are one and the same, but there's a problem with that. If that was the case, then Mordecai here would be 120 years old, making Esther about 70. So I don't think that would work. I don't think this is the Mordecai mentioned in Ezra or Nehemiah. Verse 7. And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father died and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Mordecai brought up his cousin, whose Hebrew name was Hadassah. She's better known by her Persian name, Esther, which is derived from the Persian word star. And now we're not sure where her parents passed away, when they passed away, but evidently Mordecai took her in as his own daughter. One thing we do know is that Mordecai would have had to be a eunuch. And the reason I say that is he'd have to be a eunuch to stand at the king's gate and end up having favor with the other eunuchs and so forth, as we find out later on in this chapter. And it says in verse 8, so it was when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel under the custody of Hegai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace into the care of Hegai, the custodian of the women. So after the king's edict had been proclaimed, girls from all over the empire were brought to Shushan. And of course, this included Esther. History has it that there were up to 400 girls placed in the care of Hegai, who was in charge of the harem. But here's another problem I have with this book. It's a bit difficult to understand in all this why Mordecai would have wanted his cousin to marry a heathen. After all, Ezra and Nehemiah We just went through those books. They had strong opinions against mixed marriages with unbelievers. Verse 9. Now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor. So he readily gave beauty preparations to her besides her allowance. I'm talking about food and rations. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for him from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. The young woman Esther pleased him, talking about Haggai, and she obtained his favor. So Haggai must have discerned that Esther had some qualities that would please the king, for she won his favor. So Haggai began to provide her with beauty treatments, and 7 choice maidservants were provided for her, and they moved her to the best place in the house of the women. We're talking about the best quarters of the harem there. Verse 10, Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. Mordecai forbid Esther to reveal her Jewish nationality, and of course she dutifully obeyed him. Why did he swear her to keep silent? Probably if it was known that she was not Persian, she would have had little chance of being selected as queen. We're not really sure. Verse 11. And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. Mordecai was careful to keep a close check on Esther. It says here every day he walked near the courtyard of the harem to try to gain information about his cousin. So we see a little bit of covert action here on the behalf of Mordecai. Verse 12. Each young woman's turn came to go into King Ahasuerus after she had completed 12 months' preparation according to the regulations for the women. For thus were the days of their preparation apportioned: 6 months with oil of myrrh, 6 months with perfumes, and preparations for beautifying women. So here we have more information given about each candidate's beauty treatments. Treatments required 12 months before each candidate was allowed into the king's presence. 6 months of oil of myrrh, and 6 months perfumes and cosmetics. Verse 13. Thus prepared, each young woman went to the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the women's quarters to the king's palace. So, in other words, when each candidate was ready to be presented to the king, whatever she wanted to take from her harem to his palace was given to her. She could take jewelry, clothing, whatever. Verse 14. In the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the women, to the custody of Shagzaz, the king's eunuch who kept the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and called for her by her name. So what's going on here is the maiden chosen would go to the king's presence in the evening and spend the night with him, and the next morning she would return to the second house of the harem, and they would not get out of the second house unless called by the king's request. Now, we don't really know what happened to those that were never called back. Did they spend their lives alone? Were they executed? We don't know, but in any event, we're talking about a lot of girls here. So how did Esther handle all this? Let's read verse 15 to find out. Now, when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. So did Esther ask for anything? No, she didn't. She took what Haggai advised her to take. Esther essentially said to Haggai, hey, you know the king, you know his taste, you know his not life, you know what he likes. I want you to tell me exactly what I should wear, what I should take with me, what I should do to please the king. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. So here it is, the 10th month and the 7th year of Ahasuerus' reign, that Esther was taken to the king. And this was 4 years after Vashti had been disposed. So it was a little bit of time. Why so long? Well, not exactly sure, but most likely there was ongoing military campaign in Greece at the time. Uh, One was a disastrous defeat at the hands of the Greeks, and that was about 479 BC, which would correspond to the 7th year. Verse 17. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So none of the previous candidates had attracted the king enough. They hadn't grabbed his attention for him to make them his wife. But the king here, he immediately loved Esther, and he placed the royal crown on her head, thereby making her queen. Made her queen instead of Vashti. So Esther was, let's say, a replacement. And after this, the name Vashti is no longer mentioned in this book. Verse 18. And the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and proclaimed a holiday in the provinces, and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. So here you have it. Esther's made queen, and a great wedding feast is prepared and given by the king for all his nobles and officials as a generous gesture. In other words, to mark the occasion, he proclaimed a holiday. He gave people time off work. He gave gifts liberally, as any king would do. All right, just getting into verse 19 here. When the virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai as she was brought up by him. So I find this very interesting. Why is Mordecai at the king's gate? He's at the king's gate a second time. I mean, why were the virgins gathered together a second time? There's no obvious reason for this. I mean, here Esther's already the queen. So why is Mordecai here? I suggest that this shows us another side of Mordecai. You know, as we talked about in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, the Nethinim there, um, we see Mordecai is setting himself up in a place where he can kind of work behind the scenes. He's behind the scenes, not to be seen, and try to control things. Now, the King's Gate, well, this is a place where the judgments are made, laws are passed. So I think we see Mordecai sort of getting ready to make his move here. Another thing here to note is that Esther was keeping her nationality a secret, as Mordecai instructed her to. So the question's asked here, where is her loyalty? Well, it certainly wasn't with her husband, it was with her uncle. Something to think about. Verse 21. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. These two guys, they worked in the palace. They kept control of who went in to see the king here. Something was upsetting them. They were upset about something, maybe something within the palace. In any event, they wanted to kill the king. We don't know why they wanted to kill the king, but something bothered them. Maybe the king did something stupid. Maybe the king took some stupid advice from some of his advisors. Sort of like what happens today in many governments. Verse 22. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told the queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. Matter became known to Mordecai. So, as we just found out, Mordecai sat at the gate and he sort of listened to the rumors of the day. So evidently, he either overheard or he was informed about the plot to kill the king by the two eunuch guards. We don't know, but he found out some way. And Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. So what happened here is Mordecai told the queen about the plot, and then the queen passed on that information to the king. So my question is, why did the queen give the account to the king in Mordecai's name? I have to question this. Is Mordecai trying to set himself up in authority, wishing to be where these guys were? Is there something underhandedly going on here? Something I question. Anyway, verse 23. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on a gallows. And it was written in the book of Chronicles in the presence of the king. So when Mordecai's report was investigated and found to be true, the two men were hanged on the gallows. And the entire event was recorded in the book of Chronicles, which is the official court records of memorial events in the presence of the king. So as we end this chapter 2, let me leave you with a couple of thoughts here. Why was Mordecai not rewarded? And why was there nothing written about this account? I mean, there's no record of this anywhere. What's really going on here? Well, we're going to pick it up next week and get into it. Possibly chapters 3 and 4 will give us a little hint of what's going on here. Amen and amen.